Thank you all for coming to my talk, and also thank you to everyone who's sort of remotely, virtually here. So this talk today is a talk about why in an age of almost ubiquitous potential connectivity, so many people are still left out of global networks and debates and conversations. And it's a talk that's framed by the potentials of connectivity for people that are traditionally in the world's economic margins. And I'll do two main things in this talk. I'll first have a broad discussion about online voice and representation and participation from the South, and then second, I'll focus on a project in which my team and I are grounding a lot of these issues in a study of user-generated information in Wikipedia in the Middle East, in North Africa, and in East Africa. Now, the question that I'm basically interested in is who's participating and who's represented and who isn't, and ultimately, what are the key barriers to participation and representation online? Now, really, a lot's been said about all of the revolutionary possibilities and potentials of information and communication technologies to enable new and different types of economic and social development. The idea being that if you create the right enabling conditions for the world's poor and the world's marginal, then you allow access to many of the benefits that are associated with being a part of what a lot of people call a global knowledge economy. And I have a project that's based in Kenya and Rwanda. It started a few months ago, and it looks at the effects that the arrival of a few fiber optic cables is having in the business process outsourcing, so things like call centers, software development, web development, and also tea and tourism sectors of the economy. And I put this slide up here as an entry point because I think what it does is it depicts many of the hopes that people have for the potentials of the internet in the South. This is, what you're looking at here is Nairobi's iHub, and it's basically this big open space for Kenya's tech community. It's a place that brings together young Kenyan programmers and hackers and entrepreneurs with each other and with more established business people and investors. And it works quite well. A lot of companies and ideas have been spun out of this place. But unfortunately, this sort of bubble of participation in the knowledge economy is kind of the exception rather than the rule in a lot of the places that we're looking at. So what I'm about to show you are some data on the geographies of knowledge, which provide some sort of indication of who is and who isn't represented and participating online. But before doing that, what I want to just quickly do is have a broader discussion about some of the reasons that these geographies of knowledge matter. And I want to do that by talking about a very old map. This map that you're looking at is from the 13th century. It's called the Carta Pisana. It's important because it's the world's oldest surviving navigational chart. And it's from the 13th century. So traditionally, information and knowledge about the world have been quite highly geographically constrained. And the reason for this is because the transmission of information required either the movement of people or the movement or media capable of communicating that knowledge. And I think historical maps offer a very useful illustration of some of the geographic limitations to knowledge transmission. So this thing, the Carta Pisana, it was produced somewhere on the Italian peninsula. Nobody knows exactly where. It depicts relatively accurate information about the Mediterranean, less accurate information about the fringes of Europe. So Great Britain is a bizarre rectangular shape on that map. And then no information at all about any parts of the world further afield. And I think this example, what it does is it starkly illustrates some of the constraints placed on knowledge by distance. 13th century transportation and communication technologies, so ships and books, they allowed some of the constraints of distance to be overcome by the map's Italian cartographers, but in the 13th century, those technologies just weren't effective enough to allow detailed knowledge about all of the rest of the world, about the Americas, East Asia, and everywhere else to be represented on this map. Now, not only have some parts of the world been traditionally left off the map, but some parts of the world simply just produce far more codified and transmittable knowledge than others. And that's sort of what I want to talk about a bit now. So if we look at present-day patterns of the geographies of information and knowledge, what we see are some very uneven patterns. So what you're looking at here, this is a map of the number of newspapers published per every 1,000 people by country. A darker shade means more newspapers per capita, a lighter shade means fewer per capita. What you basically see is that the world's wealthiest countries tend to have more per capita printed newspapers than the rest of the world. If you look at the distribution of academic journals, you see an even more vivid pattern of the concentration of knowledge production in just certain parts of the world. This is a chart of all journals in the Web of Knowledge Journal Citation Reports. This is probably the world's most influential collection of academic content. And the bottom bar is the United States. The one right above that is the United Kingdom. What you basically see is that the US and the UK publish far more indexed academic journals than the whole rest of the world combined. This map here, this is a cartogram. It's the same data as the last slide, just in map form with the size of each one of these rectangles representing the number of journals in each country. Over on the far left, that biggest rectangle, that's the United States, indicating that it has far more journals than anyone else. Just to the right of that big rectangle is the United Kingdom, and then the big cluster of blocks in the middle, those are all European countries. The point of this is that outside of North America and Western Europe, most of the rest of the world scarcely even shows up in these rankings. One of the starkest contrasts here is that there's more than 3 times as many journals in Switzerland than the entire continent of Africa. Let me show you the same data just in one more way. Exact same data again, visualized in a slightly different way. So here the blocks are languages. The massive blue block, those are English language journals. At the top we have Spanish. Below that we have German and French. And the big greenish block in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen are multilingual journals. So basically what you're seeing is just simply the dominance of not just the US and UK, but also English when it comes to this sort of publishing. Now, the problem is that these two types of information inequality that I've talked about, they could potentially start to reinforce each other as information in physical places become increasingly intertwined. And I think this is because there are many, many layers of computer code and digital content and information that all shape how we understand places. They shape how we enact places in very specific ways. So what I'm talking about, I'm not just talking about traditional maps of a place, but all of the layers of information that help us to understand and enact and reenact and produce and reproduce all of the places that we're in. So let me just give you an example of this. How many of you use Twitter, for instance? Quite a lot of you. So as you know, if you go to any sort of event, you look on Twitter and there's sort of layers of information floating above your heads. There's layers of information about that place that shape how you understand that place. So let me just use Nairobi's iHub as an example again here. What you see, this is just a Twitter feed of tweets that mention Nairobi's iHub. You can see just an example of how this content can form a layer of information surrounding this place. Many, many places are, of course, on something like Wikipedia. Here you're looking just at a screenshot of the iHub's page on Wikipedia. This content's very powerful and important because it of course gets reproduced and repurposed throughout the information ecosystems of the web. And then our digital shadows, the digital shadows of a place, they of course extend to all sorts of other bits of the web. Things like Foursquare, you see that 1,500 people have checked in that place. If you move outside of that specific building, you can see that all of the streets and all of the areas have been sort of meticulously mapped out by volunteers on, this is OpenStreetMap, but then of course also employees of Google and Microsoft and MapQuest and all sorts of other platforms. And then these sorts of platforms or these sorts of maps are also the platform for an almost unimaginable amount of additional content about some of these areas. So you can see, for instance, all of the photos that people take about their cities, the hundreds of videos that people tag throughout cities. I'm sure you get the point that we see all of this content sort of virtually presented to us. And we can even go down to the level of the street in many places, see a lot of this content, again, digitally reflected and presented to us. And then, of course, we can even bring all of this information into our portable mobile devices, so it can augment the ways in which we bring these places into being whilst we're in those places and enacting those places. We quite literally have access to all of this information in the palms of our hands. Now, the point of all of this is that while these geographies of information have always mattered, I think they perhaps matter more than ever now, because of the ways in which the digital and the material, or the virtual and the real, are increasingly woven together to produce these sorts of augmented spaces. And the highly uneven geographies of information that we've seen, they shape what's known and what can be known, and this in turn influences all of the ways that knowledge is produced and reproduced and enacted and reenacted. And importantly, it's not just these sorts of artifacts from the Middle Ages that display these sorts of these uneven patterns. Almost all mediums of information, book publishing, newspaper publication, patents, now in the early 21st century, they're still characterized by these very significant geographic inequalities, with the global north producing, consuming, and controlling a lot of the world's codified knowledge, and the south largely left out of these processes. And this is a fact that's only increased the importance of information usage that I've just described. And it's also increased the importance of, or I should say reinforce what Manuel Castells calls the black holes of informational capitalism. But as we move to these sorts of practices that I just talked about, these sort of practices in which we increasingly bring together information about places, in which we augment our material worlds with digital content, I think there's undoubtedly both a literal and a metaphorical space for more locally relevant information about all of the rest of the world. So what I want to do in the rest of this talk is examine some of the revolutionary possibilities of information and communication technologies to enable new and different types of economic and social development in the world's most disadvantaged places. So the idea being that if you create the right enabling conditions for the world's poor and the world's marginal, then you allow access to many of the benefits that are associated with being a part of what people call the global knowledge economy. And I want to do all of this by keeping a focus on the geographies of knowledge that are produced and reproduced in our internet age. Now, being connected can obviously mean a lot of things to the world's poor. It can mean being able to access what Wikipedia refers to as the sum of all human knowledge. It can be sharing and uploading local knowledge and contributing to global debates. And it can, of course, mean using the transparency and flows of information enabled by these new types of connectivity to do things like bypass exploitative economic relationships. But before we can talk about this coming together of humanity in this quote-unquote digital global village, I think what we should do is talk about some of the barriers to that ever happening, and the quite uneven geographies of participation and connection. And I think a useful place to do that is to look at who's actually taking part in this new wave of communication happening around the world, or in other words, to look at first of all, just who's on the internet. Actually, before doing that, I think it might be just quickly instructive to look at an even more basic metric that's crucial to information creation and sharing, and that's very simply literacy. So this map shows you the percentage, it shows you both the percentage of adults in each country that are literate and the breakdown of those statistics in some countries by gender. So darker colors on the map mean higher literacy rates, lighter colors mean less high literacy rates. And basically what you see, a lot of you probably know this, of course, in most of the world, or a lot of the world, we approach full literacy. In North America, in all of Europe, in Australasia, and a lot of East Asia, we see this. But then you get a lot of the rest of the world with significantly lower literacy rates. In Brazil, some of South and Central America, you see rates in the 80s. In the Middle East, you tend to see rates in the 70s. But then, shockingly, there's still 21 countries on our planet in which a majority of the population cannot read or write. In Niger, for instance, it's 29% of people that are literate. And I think what's also important to point out just before we move on are the significant gender gaps in literacy. If you look at India, for instance, it has a literacy rate of 61%, and according to the last census, that meant that there were over 450 million illiterate Indians. India, with this literacy rate of 61%, actually had a male literacy rate of 73%, but a female literacy rate of 48%. So obviously that means there are more illiterate than literate women in that country. In Afghanistan, the situation is even bleaker. There are 3 times as many literate men as there are women. Only 13% of women in that country are literate. So the point of this is simply that these uneven geographies of literacy alone are very significant barriers to the production and the sharing of knowledge. But let's move on to talking about who's actually on the internet. And obviously much of the sharing and the creation of information that happens today happens online. So if you're not connected, you can't participate in any of that. And this graphic is just a fairly simplistic way of showing you who's online. Each one of these little people represents 25 million internet users. So in other words, essentially what it's showing you is that if the internet were a village of, in this case, 62 people, there'd be 27 Asians, 15 Europeans, 10 North Americans, 7 Latin Americans, and 3 Africans. That only tells you part of the story, though. So this is a map of global internet penetration that I made with my colleagues Monica Stevens and Scott Hale. The size, it's a cartogram again, so the size of each box indicates the total number of users in a country. The shading indicates the penetration rate, a darker red meaning a higher internet penetration rate in that country. It's obviously very uneven. Some countries like the US have both a large total number of users and a high penetration rate. China, in contrast, has the world's largest internet population, but still quite a low penetration rate. And then you get most of the rest of the world, parts of Asia, South America, all of Africa, with low total numbers of users and internet penetration. And a lot of this unevenness came about because of the actual geographies of internet infrastructure. Some parts of the world just lack the physical connections necessary to be well connected to the global grid. What you're looking at here is a map of submarine fiber optic cables from a few years ago. And you can see that some parts of the world are just much better connected than others. And maybe more importantly, some parts just aren't connected at all. Take a look, if you can see it, at East Africa. It was one of the last parts of our planet that didn't have a single fiber optic cable running into it. This is just a close-up of connectivity on the continent from 2009. So this lack of fiber optic connectivity, what it meant was that internet access in East Africa, for instance, was much slower and much more expensive than access in much of the rest of the world. But a lot of these infrastructural constraints are being addressed. And because of this sort of stuff, this is the same map of the region's connectivity now. So if we look at internet penetration rates, what we see are some very important changes over time. And we do see a narrowing of what people call digital divides. Internet penetration growth rates in poor countries are really impressively high. So the green bar on this chart is the US, or sorry, North America. You can see that it used to be the dominant region on the internet, and now growth is sort of leveled off. But then you can look at Latin America, the purple bar, Europe, I guess the darker purple bar, Africa, the blue bar at the bottom. You can see very high growth rates in all of these places, but it's really Asia, the orange bar at the top, that really stands out on this graph. And this growth rate doesn't even show any sign of slowing down in the next few years. Even China, with the world's largest internet population, it still has, as I mentioned, a pretty low penetration rate and can potentially have a much larger online presence in the next few years. The reason I put this up and the reason I'm talking about this is because I think an important question to ask then is whether the now 200 million internet users in Latin America, the 100 million in Africa, the almost 1 billion internet users in Asia, whether all of this means that people are using this new connectivity to address many of these informational inequalities that have traditionally characterized modern media. Are all of these relatively new users now represented by relevant information? Are they able to access the information they need? Are they contributing to these sort of global discussions that are taking place? And because of the increasing amount of internet access that we're seeing around the world, with over 2 billion people online now, and theoretically very low barriers to entry, what we need to do then is ask whether the internet has enabled new and maybe less uneven geographies of knowledge and given space for information produced about the South and for information produced by people in the South. So let's just start by looking at where all of these layers of information are. And we'll do that by looking at the internet gateway that most of us probably use, and that's Google. So what you're looking at here, this this is a measure of the online content that people are creating about anywhere on Earth and then gets indexed by Google Maps. So you kind of get an indication of the massive unevenness in some of these layers of information that surround us. Dense clouds of information over some parts of the world, very little over other places. This one just shows you a zoom in of North America in just a bit more detail. I put this up because it just shows you some things like urban-rural divides in the amount of content layered over places as sort of information-rich as a lot of North America. But these maps have just shown you content in all languages. That's kind of useless. Nobody speaks all languages. So Matthew Zook and I have been working on studying the relative amount of content produced about the same places in different languages. So what you're looking at here is a map that shows the relative amount of information indexed in Google or Google Maps in English versus French in Eastern Canada. So a redder dot on this map means that there's more English language content about that place. A bluer dot means that there's more French language content about that place. And it sort of shows you what you'd expect to see, right? More English content in Ontario, more French content in a lot of Quebec. I can show you, I have a lot of these. I won't show you that many of them, but you can see a similar mirroring between offline and online geolinguistic contours in Spain if you map content in Catalan and Spanish or Castilian. Here the bluer dot means more content in Spanish, the redder dot means more content in Catalan. Let me just show you one more of these. Not quite, I guess, an unsurprising mirroring of offline geolinguistic practices. So here places with more Flemish content are orange, more French content blue. And what you basically see is that this geolinguistic mapping, it almost perfectly mirrors the divisions between Flanders and Wallonia in Belgium. But what about a part of the world where there are more unbalanced power dynamics between different linguistic groups? The Middle East, for instance. So what you're looking at here is a map that shows you the amount of content indexed in Arabic versus Hebrew. So here a blue dot indicates more Hebrew content, a red dot indicates more Arabic content. And basically what you see is that while Arabic and Hebrew information or content, it tends to annotate the same physical parts of our world, there's just a much denser cloud of Hebrew content over almost all of those places. And the point of this is that there's not just a paucity of online information about much of the developing world, but of that information that exists, a lot of it just isn't accessible to a lot of people. And again, the issue is that these representations, they start to define a place. And because of the digital augmentations that we all move through, they essentially become part of the virtual scaffolding of a place. But what about more explicitly user-generated content online? I think this might give us a better sense of who is and who isn't participating, sharing knowledge, creating content. So this is a map of photographs created in Flickr. Flickr is the world's most popular photo sharing service. For instance, the brighter dots here mean that there's just loads of images, photographs created about that place. A darker dot means that there's far fewer. No dot at all means, well, nothing at all created about that place. And again, you see I guess what you'd expect to see by now, very, very uneven geographies of information. But this is important because this is user-generated content that theoretically anyone can produce from anywhere as long as they have an internet connection. But I think a maybe more important platform for how we gain knowledge about our world is visualized here. This is a map of Wikipedia. So Wikipedia is by far the world's biggest and most used encyclopedia. It's 1,600 times bigger than Encyclopedia Britannica. 15% of all of the 2 billion people online use it on any given day, so it's very visible, it's very important. It exists in 282 languages. 40 of those language versions have over 100,000 articles in them. The English one has over 4 million, or just close to 4 million, actually. So on this map, darker shading means more Wikipedia articles created about that place. A lighter shading means fewer created about that place. And you can again see it's highly uneven. Some parts of the world characterized by these highly dense virtual representations, others barely represented at all. But those are just the raw numbers. They're not normalized for any factors that probably play a key role in determining how much content can be created about any of those places. So my team and I, we made this cartogram to show you Wikipedia articles normalized by population. And darker colors mean more articles per person in a place. Lighter colors mean fewer. The massive rectangle on the left of your screen That's North America. The even bigger block in the middle, that's Europe. Up at the top right is Asia, and then crunched down into the bottom left corner, you have the blocks of South America and Africa. Now, the relative absence of both South America and Africa is quite notable here. It's, I think, you expect to see unevenness, but the scale of the unevenness is what's surprising to me. There are more articles created about the Netherlands or Poland or the Ukraine than the entire continent of Africa or South America. And what's even more shocking to me is that there are more articles created about Antarctica than most countries in Africa. There are more articles created about fictional places like Tolkien's Middle-earth than a lot of countries in Africa. And what this map also shows you is that on a per capita basis, there's a lot of content created about Europe. And this is something you can see a bit more vividly here. On this chart, the green bars represent world population. The blue bars represent Wikipedia articles. So look at this bar, for instance. That's Asia in the middle. It has over 60% of the world's population, about 9% of the world's Wikipedia articles. Contrast that to the bars right next to it of Europe with about 12% of the world's population, but about 56% of the world's Wikipedia articles. Now, you might think that this sort of unevenness here, that this can be explained by internet penetration rates. But that's not entirely true. Remember this map of internet penetration that I showed you just a few minutes ago. It's made using the exact same style. It's a cartogram. There are obviously large inequalities in internet access around the world, but those uneven geographies of access, they still don't explain all of this unevenness in Wikipedia that we see here. Now, just to expand on this high degree of visibility that's afforded to Europe, let me show you a few more maps of Wikipedia. I'm going to show you a series of maps. And basically what we did was we mapped every article about a person in the English version of Wikipedia. So I'll quickly cycle through these. This is what you're looking at is a map of everybody in Wikipedia that was alive in the 15th century. This is the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th. Now, granted, we're only looking at the English Wikipedia on this map, not the Chinese or the Hindi versions, but what we saw was an incredibly Eurocentric history. Now, place all of this within one of Wikipedia's mottos, that's to contain the sum of all human knowledge. So I think it's a dangerous idea to imagine that we're even getting close to having a platform that contains the sum of all human knowledge. Instead, what we need to do is keep a focus on some of the significant biases that are embedded into this knowledge, which plays a very key role in shaping how we understand the world. Now, before I wrap up, what I want to also show you are some preliminary results from a case study of Wikipedia outside of the Western world. And the important thing here isn't Wikipedia itself, because you can look at other online platforms and see very similar patterns and inequalities and lack of participation from and representation about the South. But I'm focusing on Wikipedia because I think it's just an especially powerful and influential source of information. And I think it tells us a lot about issues of participation and voice and representation on the internet. So my team, Bernie Hogan, Ahmed Medhat, and myself, we're doing 2 parallel studies of Wikipedia in both the Middle East and North Africa and in East Africa. And the first question that we're asking basically involves examining whether there are disproportionately fewer articles in those places compared to the rest of the world, and also examining the local geographies of those articles. And we're also mapping various metrics, things like where are featured articles more likely to appear, where are stubs more likely to appear, long articles, short articles, articles with photographs, articles with disproportionate numbers of revisions. Those are important because those are sort of highly contested bits of knowledge. And we're doing this for the English, the French, the Arabic, the Egyptian Arabic, the Hebrew, the Persian, and the Swahili versions. That's the relatively straightforward part. What we're then doing is we're asking whether local authors comprise disproportionately fewer of the contributors to articles about their own region. So for instance, asking whether it's Egyptians or Europeans or Americans that are writing the articles about Egypt. And then, after doing that, we're also asking whether the contributions of local authors are undervalued. So to go back to this example of Egypt, that would mean asking whether Egyptians or foreigners are more likely to have their contributions stick or be deleted or be reverted if they're writing about Egypt. Now, this is all still work in progress, and it's not finished by any means, but let me just show you some of our preliminary results from the MENA region and the Horn of Africa. So what you're just looking at here is what people are writing about. So the density of information over a place. So it's articles per square kilometer is what you're looking at, the density of the cloud of information surrounding these places. So in English, a lot of what's written about, this is a map of just English Wikipedia, a lot of what's written about are the Mediterranean coasts of Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, the Nile Valley, of course, parts of the UAE, and then, of course, Israel and Palestine. Let me just show you the same data in dot form. I think that it just starkly illustrates the presences and absences in Wikipedia, especially in the Nile Valley and Israel, Palestine. Now, in Arabic, this is the map of Arabic, you can see that the densest layers of information are in the same place as English, just thinner and sparser clouds of information. But the scale of these differences, though, I think results in really almost implausible comparisons. So, for instance, there are more English articles written about North Korea than there are Arabic articles about Saudi Arabia or Libya or the UAE or many other countries in the region. And then let me just show you Hebrew. Basically, you just get a dense layer of content over Israel and Palestine and then sort of immediately surrounding bits. And you can see that same pattern if you do something like if you compare Arabic and Hebrew Wikipedias. That's what you're looking at here. A place with more Arabic content's green, a place with more Hebrew content's blue. So there's more Hebrew content about all of Israel and Palestine and most of the adjacent regions, and then Ethiopia, that's another story. But then more Arabic content about everywhere else. But this one compares English and Arabic. The pink colors mean more English content. The green colors mean more Arabic content. Now, there's very little green on the map, right? So this is important because Arabic, of course, is the world's fourth most spoken language. And in obviously not all of these countries, but in a lot of these countries, Arabic is what's spoken. And not only that, but it's not as if people aren't using Wikipedia in these places to get information that they need. It's one of the top 20 most accessed websites in Egypt. In Tunisia, it's 8th. In Algeria, it's 10th. Saudi Arabia, 18th. Bahrain, 9th. Iraq, 13th. I could go on. You get the idea. It's popular. It's visible. It's influential. But despite all of this, the Arabic Wikipedia, it's only the 25th largest Wikipedia in terms of the amount of content contributed to it. To put that in context, it's behind Romanian at 23rd, Finnish at 13th, Dutch at 4th. There's 10 times as much content in Dutch as there is in Arabic. And there's actually only a few more articles in Arabic Wikipedia than there are in the Esperanto Wikipedia. And the situation's even worse if you look at the Swahili Wikipedia or Wikipedias in other African languages. Let me just show you one more here. What you're looking at here is a map that's quite an important one, I think. This map shows you not where information's created about, but where information's created from. This is where edits to Wikipedia come from. So you can see that there's almost as many, if you look at the Middle East, there's almost as many edits that come from Israel as the whole rest of the region combined. And there would be more from Israel than all of the region if we just took out Iran, which has quite, contributes a lot, at least compared to its Arab neighbors. So we're still working on examining all of the factors that might explain these uneven geographies of content and participation. Is it internet access? Is it GDP? Is it education levels? And we're also, we're not just doing this by sort of mapping and quantitative analysis, but we're also hosting focus groups with Wikipedia editors in the region as another way of trying to get at some of these issues. Let me just show you one more of these. This is the same data, number of edits from each country for the rest of the world. Obviously, a darker red means more edits coming from that place. Lighter red means fewer from that place. So what we see is that, again, the production of knowledge has very distinct and very uneven geographies. We get very, very little coming from anywhere in Africa, for instance. You get more edits to Wikipedia coming from Hong Kong than all of Africa combined. Now, what do these maps tell us? Well, not only is there not a lot of content created from the developing world, there also isn't a lot of content created about the developing world. A lot of people and places are both literally and figuratively left off the map. And this can't simply be explained away by lack of internet access or by the fact that Wikipedia isn't a popular platform in these places. So the question then is why? Why, when the world's getting wired, when internet penetration rates are rising rapidly, why are there still these massive absences? And again, we're still working on trying to answer some of these questions, but I think 3 quick anecdotes might help us to move beyond some of all of this hype about how the internet will democratize participation and knowledge sharing from the South. Let me start with this one. I learned about this story in Ethan Zuckerman's blog. He blogged this story a while ago. Basically, Macmendi is a fictional tough guy character that became quite popular amongst the Kenyan internet community. And what's important about him is he was maybe Kenya's first viral internet sensation, that demonstrating it's not just Europeans and Americans that can flood your Facebook feed with cute sleeping kittens and dancing hamsters and all the other memes that you're surrounded by. But the problem was that when his Kenyan fans tried to create an entry for him in Wikipedia, the page kept being deleted by people saying that the page wasn't notable, that it was nonsense, that it was incomprehensible. It was none of those things, but this kept happening because the editors that were deleting the page were clearly from outside the region, and they didn't understand the significance of this meme in East Africa. And there wasn't a way for the Kenyan editors to get this to stick until Ethan Zuckerman blogged about it, then CNN reported on it, and then finally Macmendi could get a page that wasn't deleted. Now, the point of this story isn't that we need more articles about Kenyan fake superheroes, but that even well-educated people and computer-literate people in a place like Kenya can face very significant struggles and challenges when using and contributing to a global platform like this. My second story kind of illustrates a similar thing happening, but the point of this one it's to show that it isn't just geographic or cultural inequalities that influence the type of content that's available. So there are some estimates that fewer than 15% of Wikipedia editors are female, and we can see those inequalities reproduced, I think, when we look at a Wikipedia article like this one. So this is the Wikipedia article about a guy called Fyodor Vasilyev. And what this article tells you, it tells you about a woman, and a woman who had more children than any other woman on Earth. This woman had 67 children, I think. And so she had 67 children. That is obviously noteworthy. Nobody else had ever had that many children. But interestingly, she doesn't have an article about her. It's her husband that has an article about him. What's he famous for? Being married to the woman that had more children than anyone else. Now, given the fact that the Vasilyevs were alive in the 18th century, these sort of masculinist biases that shaped how this story was recorded, they're perhaps not that surprising. But what's more important is for contemporary information creators on Wikipedia to become aware of these sorts of biases and actively work to not just reproduce them. So the issue is not just a lack of female editors, but also the gender biases that are embedded into the ways in which we discuss and represent subjects in Wikipedia. Let me give you my final story. This one's also from Kenya. This is a picture from a session at a big conference in Nairobi's conference center. This took place about a year and a half ago or so. And on the screen was one of these maps of the submarine fiber optic cables that I showed you, in fact, the exact same map that I showed you earlier. And the speaker was giving this impassioned talk about how faster internet speeds would fundamentally transform the region, how they'd allow a new, different kind of development to take place, how they'd allow East Africans to become part of the knowledge economy. As he was speaking, the screen went blank, the lights turned off, and it took a few seconds for a backup generator to bring power back to the room. What had happened was one of Nairobi's frequent power cuts interrupting his talk. Now, the laughter in the room indicated the irony of the situation wasn't really lost on anyone. But what I think these stories illustrate is that it can be easy to forget about a lot of the underlying structural and social barriers with all of the expectations and buzz and hype surrounding the internet in the developing world. A lot of these expectations, they see the arrival of the internet and broadband as some sort of panacea for development that it just can't live up to. So just to wrap this all up, I think it's important not to forget the iHubs of the world and the quite revolutionary and empowering promises and potentials of the internet for the developing world. People use the internet to not just non-proximately connect with friends and family, but learn, share information, check market prices, trade, buy bypass exploitative economic relationships. But I think it's equally important to remember first that despite the rapid growth in internet access, for much of the world, most people on our planet are still entirely disconnected. And second, even amongst those 2 billion that are now online, a significant number are still left out of global networks and debates and conversations. So the internet's obviously a network that enables selective connections between people and information, and it's a network that's characterized by highly uneven geographies. And in many ways, it's just reinforced all of these global patterns of visibility and representation and voice that we're used to in the offline world. So the issue isn't just that some people in the developing world are disconnected, but also that many of the benefits of the internet don't automatically arrive into the developing world once internet connections do. So in other words, what I'm saying is that while the internet's clearly a prerequisite for a lot of economic development and participation in the 21st century knowledge economy, we shouldn't forget that it's by no means a determinant of any of those things. That's all I have for you. Thank you very much.